Taylor, hello.
Hey, Abigail.
It's so good to be with you today.
Thank you.
We have tea, not coffee today.
Yes, and it's very appropriate. It's warming me up really good.
Me too. It's kind of rainy out, so
Yeah.
it's a nice sweet and spicy. It's nice.
It's a good pick.
It is. Thank you. So we are talking today about our Rooted series, and we're coming to the end of Genesis. And this covers, I believe, 3 chapters. We're on week 5 of Genesis. And I think it's a really interesting section. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah. I am excited as I talk about these things. I'm actually preaching this Sunday too.
Oh,
So
that's exciting.
So in chapter 48, this is where Joseph brings his sons who've been born in Egypt to Jacob.
Okay.
Because all of the family is now living in Egypt. But Joseph brings his sons to Jacob, and Jacob actually blesses Joseph's sons. And in the blessing, he brings those 2 sons into the family promise that they have toward land and being a blessing. And this was really interesting to me because I couldn't remember why Manasseh and Ephraim were included in the list. Like later we'll see the list of the tribes of Israel. And
like the 12 tribes.
Yeah, the 12 tribes. And Manasseh and Ephraim are included in some of those lists. And Joseph's name is not included instead. So his sons essentially were brought into Jacob's family with this blessing. And then in the next chapter, Jacob calls all of his sons around him and has some final words for them as he's on his deathbed. And he has something that he says to each son, variations of what kind of thing that he says to them, whether it feels like a blessing or in some cases it feels like a curse. And in some cases we don't have enough context to know why he says what he says. It could be that
mysterious.
It is mysterious.
Yes.
It could be that he's projecting into the tribe's experience in the future, but it's meaningful that he has a long section here of being able to speak directly to his sons. And then at the end of it, he asks them that after he's died, that they will take him back to where they've come from, to Canaan, so that he can be buried in the same place where Isaac had been buried and other family members. And then at the beginning of 50, we see the sons, led by Joseph, honoring his request. And something that's interesting to me is how long the mourning period is. Like they really lean into the Egyptian cultural expression of grief and honoring of the dead. And yeah, it's an interesting intercultural experience to me that Joseph has lived so long in Egypt that the burial rites that he gives his dad are Egyptian.
Yes.
And people even comment, they say the Egyptians are holding a solemn ceremony of mourning, but it's Joseph and his brothers and then also Pharaoh's household. So it's like an intermixed cultural space.
Wow. That's really interesting. I think, reading this with a particular cultural lens where we live now, and then it's so different at this time. When you read this, what about this text brings you life when it looks so different from your own? And maybe what's a section that makes you struggle or wrestle, or at least gives you some curiosity?
Yeah, I think that for both the struggle and the wrestle are where it ends, where chapter 50 ends, and it's where Joseph has sort of like the climactic sort of reassurance and reconciliation moment with his brothers. But they're fearful. They're like, our dad has died. Maybe that's the only reason why Joseph hasn't actually taken revenge against us. So like we need to convince him that either our dad told him not to our dad told him to treat us well, or we need to tell him that we'll be his slaves or something. But they just come with so much fear about how if Joseph's forgiveness was real, like even though many chapters before he had said that, and that's a place where I see tension, and I also see comfort. That forgiveness is hard to believe sometimes.
Yes.
And it's hard to like when situations change, does the forgiveness still stand?
And it reminds me, this is Jacob, their father Jacob, right? Is this their, that's Joseph's father is Jacob?
Yeah.
Jacob does that in his life so many times. He has a lot of distrust. Like somebody will promise him and then he acts the other way based on that. Like he doesn't trust them. And then it's so interesting that his sons would expect that from their own brother. Like that feels like there's a family culture that's happening there that they're following in line with.
Yeah,
Wow.
that's a really important thing to point out. There's lots of sort of maybe inheritances of interactions between family members that are repeated in this story. And it's so then going to the comfort part, Joseph, when he hears their fear, he weeps. And then he reassures them, like, you don't have to be my slaves. You're my brothers. And I'm not in the place of God. Because, in fact, God's been working in all these situations and has brought good, has preserved life, even though your intention had been to harm me. God actually preserved my life and has preserved lots of lives because of what happened.
Whereas, and he was in a much more, you would think that he would distrust them based on what they'd done to him. But then he's still saying, no, I'm not returning that your actions with the same intensity. He's still turning and forgiving them.
Yeah.
That's very powerful and feels a little unfair. Like on his part, he could have, I don't know, there's so much that he could have done to them at that point, and yet he still, like, yet again gives them more chances, which is really powerful.
It is really powerful. Yeah, he definitely had reason to be upset.
Yeah.
To say it lightly.
Yeah.
And now he also has lots of power and prestige. He could really, like, bring it to them.
Wow.
Because not only on moral standpoint does he have a higher ground, but like in the society that now they're strangers to Egypt, but he's been in a prominent position in Egypt for a long time. So even like their status is different, but he doesn't use that against them.
That's both like convicting and challenging and also encouraging as I deal with my situations in my own life and when I get upset or maybe if I do something wrong and just when I, maybe I'm afraid of how someone will react, but also it feels vulnerable to be open to their forgiveness, right? Does that how, to me, I'm just like, if I were to ask forgiveness, it feels like a vulnerable act.
Yeah, it does take trust, which maybe is why the brothers don't directly ask him for his forgiveness. Instead, indirectly, they say, our dad said that you should forgive us.
That's really a good point.
Yeah,
wow, there's a lot to take away.
It takes a lot of trust to ask for forgiveness, too.
That's beautiful.
And with all of those things, something that I'm thinking about is how Genesis begins with God's created order and calls it good. And there's right relationship. And then at the end of the story, after all of this stuff in the middle of, or I guess not at the end of the story, at the end of this part of the story of Genesis, there's all the things in the middle that are lots of ways that we see things not be good. Even inter-family not goodness. Right. And we see that right up till the last pages of Genesis. But then in the end, Joseph's decision to say, like, God is preserving our lives, even as your intentions hadn't been for that, but God's is for that. And so, like, I extend my forgiveness to you. He's participating in the good order that God started the book with. And that's something that I've been thinking about, like a question that's sort of forming is, what sort of action might we feel emboldened to do, like Joseph here? What might we feel so bold to do because we trust that God is working toward preserving life and that God is working towards preserving God's promises? Like, if we know that God is able to even take intentions like the brothers' intentions and work it towards the preserving of life, like So how might we be able to participate then in our actions with bold actions?
Yes. So here's a question to end our time. If you were to give people an encouragement as they read, but also an encouragement towards that boldness, what would you say to them?
Yeah, I think that maybe in the same way that as in reading Genesis, we've experienced the messiness of stories. It hasn't been like neat and tidy, but still we see God's promise continues and people like Joseph participating in God's preserving of life and promise.
Yeah.
My encouragement would be that we can also see the messiness in our own individual and shared stories and know that things don't have to be neat and tidy in order for God's promise to be preserved in our own lives. And I think the question could be like, what is God's promise that you're relying on?
Wow.
Like what do we know of God's promises that we're then able to like know that God is preserving those things? So that's something I'm thinking about too, like something that Jesus might have said, like what sort of promise do we see in the life of Jesus that God is still preserving?
Wow. Yes.
For us today.
That's a beautiful question to hold. Thank you so much for this time. It was I have a lot to take away from this. So thank you for being here.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
Loved it.